keep f***ing. You want me to stick my in his mouth, but I ain't gonna do it. I ain't gonna do it, cause you a f***.
What do you get when you mix raw talent, a ruthless loyalty code, and a rapper who never bites his tongue? You get the Game, one of the most unpredictable figures in hip-hop, and behind his platinum plaques and iconic features lies a warpath of feuds, fallouts, and fists thrown in the booth, in the streets. From G-Unit implosions to real-life gun standoffs and diss tracks that nearly sparked riots, these are the top 7 artists the Game hated the most. We begin at number 1 with 50 Cent. A feud so explosive, it didn't just shake the culture, it helped define a whole era of 2000s hip-hop. At first, it was a match made in music heaven. Dr. Dre had just signed the Game to Aftermath, and 50 Cent, who was riding high on the global success of Get Rich or Die Trying, became the key to launching Game's mainstream career. Together, the trio produced chart-topping hits like How We Do and Hate It or Love It. But while it looked like the perfect partnership on the charts, behind the scenes, cracks were already forming. 50 Cent kicked the Game out of G-Unit. According to 50, he expected absolute loyalty, especially when it came to his battles. He was in the middle of heated wars with heavyweights like Nas, Jadakiss, and Fat Joe, and he expected Game to publicly ride for him, no questions asked.
You come back and you say you don't have a problem even with the people that I have issues with.
50 also expressed frustration, claiming that after giving Game 3 career-defining hit records, he didn't expect to be met with what he saw as arrogance and ingratitude.
Discussing what I had put out on Piggy Bank, and he was like, yo, I ain't got nothing to do with that, and this, and that. And I'm like, I just gave you your first 3 singles.
But the Game tells a different story entirely. He insists the real root of 50's anger wasn't disloyalty, it was jealousy. Specifically, that the streets embraced Game's debut album, the documentary, more than 50's own album, The Massacre.
The streets are saying that the documentary was better than The Massacre, which it is, and 50 got jealous and kicked me out of G-Unit. And
50, on the other hand, never bought into Game's narrative. Over the years, he's downplayed Game's talent, claiming that without his help, Game would have never achieved the same success. In his eyes, Game was just a byproduct of G-Unit's momentum.
It's because even Dre felt like what he was doing wasn't good enough or up to standard until I actually offered those songs.
The breaking point came in early 2005. During a radio interview at Hot 97, 50 Cent shocked the hip-hop world by announcing that The Game was no longer part of G-Unit. The moment that broadcast ended, Game and his entourage showed up at the station. What followed was chaos. An altercation outside led to gunshots being fired. A member of Game's crew was injured. The NYPD shut down the scene. The beef didn't die down, it evolved. Diss tracks became press interviews. Taunts turned into campaigns. Game's infamous G-Uno movement became a viral mockery of G-Unit, echoed at shows, plastered on merch, and shouted by fans across the country. This wasn't just a rap beef. This was the collapse of what could have been hip-hop's most unstoppable dynasty. 2 juggernauts brought down by ego, competition, and the unforgiving politics of loyalty in the rap game. Next up at number 2, we've got Jay-Z, and here's where things get a little more calculated. Unlike the chaos that marked Game's beef with 50, his tension with Jay-Z was more of a psychological standoff. It didn't erupt overnight, it simmered slowly. It started with Game boldly calling out Jay-Z on his early mixtapes, stating flat out, "I'll take down the King of New York." At the time, Jay wasn't just a rapper. He was the president of Def Jam, a corporate titan with the power to open or close industry doors. And according to Game, Jay used that power to try to block his rise. Even those close to Game warned him. His then partner and mother of his child reportedly told him, "This could end your career." But Game didn't care. He doubled down.
the mother of my children, because she was a Jay-Z fan, and she was just like, you don't know what you're doing. He's gonna come back, and we're not gonna be able to survive.
Jay never issued a direct response, but the hip-hop community couldn't help but speculate. Lyrics from Jay's Dear Summer and other subtle lines were interpreted as shots at Game, subliminals rather than declarations. Game, however, didn't play it quiet. He fired back with tracks like My Bitch and Uncle Otis, going straight for the jugular. He later said Jay was too strategic to respond outright, too tied up in business deals and brand image to get messy. But Game, he was unfiltered, raw, and willing to risk everything.
Number one, he is smart, and I think that he knows that I'm reckless and there's nothing that I can't say, but he has to be filtered because he's more of a businessman and he's a little bit older and he's doing all these business deals.
This was more than lyrical warfare. It was a clash between corporate control and street authenticity, a cold war between a rising disruptor and the king on the throne. Number 3 on the list is Meek Mill, a feud sparked by a misunderstanding, but fueled by pride, loyalty, and one chaotic night in Los Angeles. According to Game, the whole thing started with Sean Kingston. Game had looked out for Kingston several times in LA, even saying he saved him in certain situations. One night after the club, Game invited Kingston to a studio session. Kingston agreed, but when it came time to leave, he bailed without explanation. Game took it as a sign of disrespect.
Following me, but then when I got on the freeway, he got over real quick and I guess ghosted me. And so I was kind of sorry.
So the next time he saw Kingston in a club, he warned Meek Mill, who was in the building and just off probation, that there might be drama. Game didn't want Meek caught in the middle.
I went over to Meek and I told Meek, I'm like, yo, man, I got some static with Sean, so know what's up, you know what I'm saying? The middle of that shit because of his case. So I was just looking out, you know what I'm saying? And so, went left and Sean Kingston, not by me, obviously. But after that, Meek told me that, Game was plotting on me. And I was like, that's crazy because I didn't tell a situation you want to be in if you just got off papers.
Later that night, Kingston was assaulted and his jewelry stolen. He told people Meek had warned him that Game was plotting on him. That rumor made its way back to Game, who felt like Meek had basically snitched. What followed was a lyrical onslaught. Game dropped.
So I felt like Meek, kind of like
92 bars, taking direct shots at Meek and threatening violence. Meek responded over Young M.A.'s "ooh," pulling in O'Malley and Beanie Siegel. But Beanie later said he got dragged into it without knowing the full story, leaving Game even more offended. Game didn't stop there. He doubled down with Pest Control, another diss targeting Meek's credibility. Eventually, the two squashed their beef. But during those months, it was one of the most heated and emotionally charged rivalries in rap. A perfect example of how quickly loyalty, miscommunication, and egos can turn a quiet warning into a public war. Which brings us to number 4, Ross Cass. The drama started when Ross Cass allegedly made an offensive reference to the Game's son in a freestyle. That was a line Game wasn't willing to let slide. And things came to a head on New Year's Eve 2006, when both rappers found themselves in the same nightclub. According to Game, he didn't hesitate. As soon as the countdown hit, he ran into Ross Cass with punches and knocked him out cold.
No, when I ran into him, ping, ping, ping.
But Ross Cass tells a different story. In a later interview, he denied being knocked out.
Whack, and I knocked him out. Like, bro, you didn't. Why do you keep lying about that?
Yeah, so he was claiming.
Instead, he claimed that Game smashed a bottle over his head and then lied about it afterward.
When they do the rapping thing, the best you can do is hit me in the back of the head with a bottle and lie about it. That's the best.
Ross Cass didn't just stop at that. He confidently declared that lyrically, Game couldn't compete with him. In his own words, "I broke his records. The only thing Game ever beat him at," he said, "was throwing bottles, not bars." At the time, after the club incident, what followed was a wave of diss tracks. Game dropped 120 bars, going for the jugular. Ross Cass clapped back with caution. There was never a truce. Even though Game later admitted he respected Ross's skill, the beef remained raw and unresolved. This wasn't about hit singles or headlines. This was pride, principle, and two West Coast MCs who refused to back down. It stands as one of the most personal and unfiltered feuds of Game's career, where the microphone became secondary to real-life aggression. Now, at number 5, things escalate to a near-deadly level. We're talking about Suge Knight, a man whose name alone carries weight, fear, and history in the world of hip-hop. Game once spoke on the legacy of Death Row Records and its impact on his hometown of Compton, calling it violent and destructive. He felt the label's glory days had cost the streets too many lives, some of them people he personally knew. And in classic Game fashion, he didn't hold back in saying it on record. That didn't sit well with Suge. At a Vibe Awards after-party, Suge Knight reportedly pulled up on Game deep, with about 60 gang affiliates in tow, ready to confront him face-to-face. But Game wasn't the type to back down. He stood his ground, looked Suge in the eye, and pulled a gun on him and his crew. "I'm really from Compton," he told him. That moment didn't erupt into violence. Instead, it earned Suge's respect. There was no friendship after that, but there was an understanding. This was bigger than rap. It was survival, and Game passed the test. Sliding into number 6, we've got Lil Durk. Back in 2014, tensions were brewing between Tyga and Lil Durk. What started as lyrical shots quickly turned into something more personal. Looking for backup, Tyga called up The Game and asked him to jump on a track called Chirac to LA Ain't, a direct diss aimed at Durk. At the time, Game admitted he didn't even know who Lil Durk was.
Tyga and Durk had some drama. I didn't even know who Lil.
But out of loyalty to Tyga and his instinct to defend the West Coast, he agreed. The song dropped, and Tyga quietly backed out of the situation. That left Game alone to carry the weight of the feud. It didn't take long before Game and Durk crossed paths at a nightclub in Los Angeles. No blows were exchanged, but the standoff was real. Both entourages stood their ground, silently waiting for the other to flinch. According to Lil Durk, the next day, some old school guys put him and Game on the phone. They talked it out and agreed to let it go.
Next morning, a couple of the big, older guys out here, the old school guys out here, put us on a three-way call. We saying we squashed this.
Years later, they laughed about the whole thing during an Instagram live session. In the end, the beef didn't explode. It fizzled. But it was a perfect reminder of how quickly things can spiral in hip-hop and how sometimes one phone call can stop a war before it starts. And finally, at number 7, we end with a beef that was more hilarious than hostile: Joe Budden. It all started when The Game dropped a track with a jaw-droppingly explicit verse about Cian Santana, who was Joe Budden's fiancée at the time. Game bragged in detail about their alleged past relationship, and as expected, it stirred up immediate controversy. Joe responded on the Joe Budden podcast, and he didn't hold back. He called the bars corny, unnecessary, and loser shit. More than anything, Joe was frustrated that Game chose to air it out in a song rather than calling him directly. In Joe's words, that's not man stuff, that's clout chasing. But Game wasn't interested in peace. He clapped back on Instagram with, "You can't sue nobody for discovering the why before you." Then added fuel to the fire, claiming he'd already died, turned Joe into a podcast personality. There were no diss tracks, no club run-ins, just Instagram captions, podcast jabs, and unfiltered ego shots, traded from afar. A modern-day hip-hop feud brought to you by Wi-Fi. And that pretty much says it all. Because in the Game's world, whether it's digital digs or street-level smoke, every beef tells a story. From bullets to bars, the Game has never been afraid to speak his truth, even if it meant turning allies into enemies. Whether it was loyalty, pride, or just pure ego, each beef left a mark, not just on his legacy, but on the culture itself. So what do you think? Was Game just too real for the industry, or was he his own worst enemy? Drop your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned, because in the world of hip-hop, peace is temporary, but beef, that lives forever.